Whenever someone asks me to list my favourite game studios, without hesitation, From Software always comes out on top. The library that they've built up over the last 15 years or so is the stuff of legend, easily letting them slot in with the all-time greats. I've been a fan of From Software since 2013. I genuinely think that out of the 7 games I'm talking about today, they're mostly all 10 out of 10s, and ranking them has been really tough. And yeah, I'm including Sekiro, even though it doesn't technically fit within the Soulsborne framework, but everyone else on YouTube seems to just group it in with the rest, so I thought, what the hell, I'll do it too then. If you don't think Sekiro should be here, then just skip over it, I guess. I don't know, it's my list anyway. There's no real criteria in this list. I've tried to account for level and world design, bosses, and the overall feel of the game, but at the end of the day, it's more about how much I like each game. Oh, and also, I didn't factor DLCs into the ranking as a couple of these games don't have DLCs. Also, I want to rank the DLCs in a separate video, so get subscribed if you want to see that. But this list is for the vanilla base games only, so with that, let's kick this ranking off with... Yeah, to no one's surprise, Dark Souls 2 sits ever so slightly at the bottom of this list. Remember a second ago when I said these games are all mostly 10s? Well, Dark Souls 2 is the exception, but it's still like a 9 out of 10. I know that Dark Souls 2 gets a fair amount of hate, but I don't think that all of it is warranted. A major complaint I hear is about how the world's very linear, but I think it's similar to Demon Souls, except from instead of warping to the start of each archstone from the Nexus, you just walk there from Majula. It does feel a bit stitched together though. Demon Souls has very distinct themes for each of its archstones, but in Dark Souls 2, who can forget the classic lift from Earthen Peak to the Iron Keep? Dark Souls 2 also features my least favourite level in any of these games, the Shrine of Amana. Those mage snipers and these swamp undead things paired with basically invisible instant death pits, I just hate it so much. Go slow and you'll get jumped by those zombies, and go too fast and you'll get sniped anyway. It really drags the whole game down, and there are some forgettable areas too, like the Huntsman Copse and the Doors of Pharos. But there are some areas that I think rank among the best in the trilogy, like the Forest of Fallen Giants. It's one of the only areas in the game that loops around on itself and has shortcuts back to the main bonfire, and it's such a great starting area, provided you went there first. Majula is also probably my favourite hub area in any From Software game. The evening atmosphere and gentle music is just magical. Unfortunately, the level design is brought down by the ridiculous number of mobs that you have to contend with at times. The aforementioned Shrine of Amana is definitely the best example, but areas that would be absolute masterpieces like the Iron Keep are held back by these ridiculous number of enemies that they seemingly just threw in on the map. Bloodborne does the exact same thing, but its combat is far more fast paced, and so dodging around everything and using sweeping attacks makes quick work of them. They also tend to have very little health in Bloodborne when this happens. Dark Souls 2's slower, more deliberate combat system just really clashes with the enemy placement. Something else that irks me quite a bit is how your character only moves in 8 directions. It feels so strange to go from full analog movement in the previous 2 games, but then Dark Souls 2 has directional inputs. Obviously they were optimizing the game for keyboard and mouse instead of controller, which is just an odd decision. It feels a lot clunkier than Dark Souls 1, even though you can now roll in more than 4 directions when you're locked on. Good luck trying to jump with any kind of precision though. But I do appreciate some of the more obtuse game design choices in Dark Souls 2, even if it isn't always well executed. Losing part of your health every time you die gets frustrating quick, but you're given more than enough human effigies and it's way less frustrating than it was in Demon Souls. The compromise between Dark Souls 1's Estus flasks and Demon Souls' grass is also really good. Starting off with just one Estus makes early battles tenser, as relying too much on life gems and being short on them can be the downfall of a playthrough. But it emphasises just how sacred Estus flasks are, and finding shards and actually upgrading your flask is extremely satisfying, which is why they kept it in subsequent games. I still don't understand why they locked iframes behind a specific stat though, and to top it off they didn't explain it in the game. It led to quite a bit of confusion back when the game came out because I had the roll timing down from Dark Souls 1 but still took damage. If you don't know about the agility stat, then you're basically just out of luck. You might think the game has terrible hitboxes, and I don't blame anyone for thinking that. Thankfully it's quite easy to level up early on and get your frames up to near Dark Souls 1's level, but it still feels like I could have used those souls for something else. Power stancing is an incredible addition to the game though. The amount of build variety in this game is bonkers. Second only to Elden Ring, and being able to dual wield pretty much anything as long as it's in the same class is just ridiculous considering all of the different weapon types. It's something that Dark Souls 3 pared back quite dramatically. I think that ultimately the biggest issue with Dark Souls 2 is that it focuses on quantity over quality, and unlike Elden Ring which has both of those things, Dark Souls 2 just feels very inconsistent. This is never more apparent than the boss fights, which are simultaneously some of the best and worst that From Software's ever done. Smelter Demon? Banger, as long as you have iframes. Feldstadt? Even better, and the Looking Glass Knight is my favourite of all the boss summons for player to PvP gimmicks in these games. But then again, you have some bosses that are absolute pushovers, like the Covetous Demon, which honestly shouldn't even be a boss, and the Demon of Song, which just caps off a shitty area, honestly. It just feels like they didn't know what they were doing half the time, which results in a really inconsistent experience. That said, there's still a lot to like about Dark Souls 2, and calling it the worst in a list of absolute masterpieces is still worth praise. It's still a lot better than most Souls-likes out there. The one that started it all. Demon's Souls is a masterpiece. It's only this low because it has the curse of simply being the most rudimentary Soulsborne game. From Software used this game as a template, then iterated on it so much that in comparison, Demon's Souls feels a bit simplistic compared to later games. What is here though is very high quality. The game structure remains its most unique aspect. I did mention earlier how Dark Souls 2 built on the structure of this game to make it more seamless, although it still has a bit of railroading as far as certain areas being locked until you've done others. In Demon's Souls, once you've completed 1-1, you can go straight to World 5 if you want, before it all comes together at the end for a final couple of levels that are locked off until you completed the others. And the level design here ranks among the best that From Software's ever done. With the exception of 5-1, every area in this game is full of looping shortcuts and excellent enemy placement. Even though there aren't technically any secret areas like in later games, there are a few hidden areas thanks to this game's world tendency mechanic. Basically, depending on whether you defeat bosses or you die with full health, your tendency level can shift from white to black, which either makes the game easier or harder. But also some areas in the game are completely blocked off if you don't meet the tendency requirements. Does this game explain it to you? No, of course it doesn't, but that's kind of the point of Demon's Souls. Losing half your HP when you die is really frustrating though, and unlike Dark Souls 2, which allows you to recover it with human effigies, Demon's Souls absolutely punishes you until you beat the level's boss. There is an item you can use to replenish your health, but it's very rare, and there's also a ring in World 1-1 which gives you back an extra quarter of your HP, and honestly it's going to be something you have equipped for the entire game because, again, if you die with full health, your tendency can be lowered, making the game even harder. It isn't actually very difficult though, and much of the bosses rely very heavily on gimmicks instead of being tests of your skill. Even the bosses which are more one-on-one are very simplistic with easily telegraphed attacks and small movesets. Again, for the time I imagine these bosses were quite difficult, but nowadays they're a cakewalk. The real difficulty of Demon's Souls comes in the level design and normal enemies, some of which are pretty unpredictable. There are no bonfires or checkpoints of any kind in Demon's Souls, instead relying on aforementioned shortcuts, but some levels like World 1-2 don't even have any shortcuts, so the run back to the boss is pretty tedious. But honestly, the weapon variety is already pretty great, and some mainstays make their first appearance here, like the Uchi Katana and the falchions. Upgrading your weapons is extremely convoluted though, like you have to find a blacksmith in World 2-1, and then you need to go and farm very specific types of shards for each weapon type. This kind of ridiculous upgrading mechanic would be scrapped in later games, but here it's so confusing. But it is a good game though, like I said, it's just got the drawback of being the first of its kind. Putting Dark Souls 3 so low doesn't really feel right, but it's a testament to From Software that the third worst Soulsborne game is this good. Dark Souls 3 is really streamlined. I'd argue it's the most simple of all the Souls games from a gameplay perspective. They basically cut out all of the unnecessary gimmicks and weird design choices of previous games and created a more accessible experience. Taking notes from Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3 is much more action oriented with faster combat and way more room for error. If you make a mistake in Dark Souls 2, like you heal at the wrong time or you try to get a quick extra attack in, you'll be punished severely. But in Dark Souls 3 though, you can basically just tank a lot of attacks, and using an Estus Flask is really fast and snappy. That doesn't mean that Dark Souls 3 isn't difficult, instead the bosses are far more aggressive with ridiculously large movesets to make up for it. Unfortunately, the level design suffers a bit. Dark Souls 3 is a very consistently good game with no bad or tedious areas, but it doesn't have any that I would say stand out either. Dark Souls 3 is really linear, not just from a world design perspective, but the levels too. They act very much like a series of corridors, with the exception of the Cathedral of the Deep, which is probably my favourite area in the game, with its single bonfire and many shortcuts back to it. It's a shame that the boss of the area is so terrible. Another high point of the game is Irithyll, which acts in a somewhat similar way, although it's far less interconnected. I absolutely adore the slow build up throughout the area though, as you slowly start to see more landmarks from Dark Souls 1, before the big reveal that you've been in Anor Londo the entire time. It's one of those moments in gaming that will stick with me forever, and I'll never forget the first time I experienced it. It's just one of the few examples of a recycled area used really effectively. I said that this is a really streamlined game, and that's true. There aren't any gimmicks, and that's both a blessing and a curse. The closest thing we have is the Embers, which, and this is going to be my hot take of the day, but they're pretty much the same concept as in Demon's Souls. Defeating a boss restores your Ember, which gives you a boost to your health. The only difference in Dark Souls 3 is that when an Ember's not active, it doesn't laugh in your face by visibly reducing your health, it just boosts your health instead. It's a buff instead of a debuff. It's that kind of positive reinforcement that Dark Souls 3 aimed for in order to be a bit more accessible. I do kind of miss the obtuse game mechanics of previous games though, but it arguably just makes Dark Souls 3 a lot more balanced and consistent overall. But they did remove power stancing in this game, which I've always found a bit odd considering it was the best thing about Dark Souls 2. But in its place are weapon arts. They're like special attacks which cost MP to execute, and honestly I'm not that keen on them. I tend to avoid them if I can because there's just too long of a wind up with too little payoff. And unlike Elden Ring, each weapon has a fixed weapon art that you can't change. So if you love the weapon but hate the weapon art, then you just have to deal with it. It's a cool concept, but it's one that I've never found to be all that useful in this game. I'm also not a fan of some of the stat allocation. Having a separate stat for equip load is just another case of wasted levels. It was the same in Dark Souls 2, but in Dark Souls 1 your equip load went up with your stamina. I also don't mind teleporting back to Violink Shrine to level up. This was more of an issue in 2016 with the terrible load times on the Xbox One, but obviously load times are basically non-existent these days. Returning to Violink after taking down a particularly hard boss and doing all of your upgrades at once before returning to the main game is a great gameplay loop. The bosses are really the highlight of Dark Souls 3 then, and like I said a minute ago, they're far more aggressive and varied, but they're never unfair. There are less bosses than 2, but almost everyone in this game's flawless. So yeah, Dark Souls 3 is a great game, but I don't think it quite reaches the heights of the next few. It's consistently great, but rarely amazing. Oh man, here come the pitchforks. I feel the need to reiterate that every single game on this list is a masterpiece. Bloodborne's one of the greatest games ever made, as are the next 3 games on this list, so don't get upset about its placement. Sony's been sitting on a literal goldmine for years, and the only real negative of Bloodborne is its performance, being locked down to PS4 and never getting any kind of 60 FPS patch. Bloodborne's quite unique. Its setting being a mixture of Gothic Victoriana and Lovecraftian horror. As the game progresses, it becomes more twisted until you're fighting aliens and cosmic beings. The insight mechanic is genius. The higher it is, the more you can see. Fear of the unknown being utilised greatly here. But mechanically the game's different from the Souls games. Much like Demon's Souls, there aren't traditional bonfires, and the healing's like a mixture between that game and the Souls games, with fixed healing items instead of replenishing flasks. Your character's also much more agile, not dodge rolling, but instead jumping out of the way of danger, and attacks are lightning fast. The trade-off is that enemies are very aggressive too, more so than in Dark Souls 3. Parrying's an essential mechanic in Bloodborne, and pulling it off is immensely satisfying as visceral attacks do a ton of damage and produce this incredible sound effect. You need to stay on the offensive in this game too. Each weapon has 2 different states, both with their own movesets, and there aren't any weapon types in Bloodborne. Instead, every weapon in the game is vastly different from one another, so build variety comes down to choosing a specific weapon and just learning its moves, even though I always default to the sword cleaver because it's just ridiculously overpowered. There's hardly anything I can criticise this game for. Like, yeah, it's a little short, and yeah, farming for blood vials can be a bit tedious if you run out, but they're not exactly negatives. Everything about this game is just incredible. I think the bosses are among the best From Software's ever done. I love how animated and reactive they are, where they react to each attack that you land. The world design harkens back to Dark Souls ever so slightly. There's one big main area that you'll get to about 3rd way through the game, and I love how it branches off to different areas. It feels a bit more open even if it isn't. Yeah, I just don't really know what else to say. It's a fantastic game, and I just wish Sony would remaster it. That's all I want. Just give me a bare bones remaster and I'll pay for it. Again, if you don't think Sekiro should be here, then just pretend that it isn't, but I love Sekiro more and more every time I play it. I had no interest in it when it came out back in 2019, and in fact, when I did get around to playing it, I absolutely hated it. I made the mistake of playing it like a Souls game, relying too heavily on dodges, and so I stumbled my way through the game and made it to the Corrupted Monk before quitting it for good. It wasn't until I replayed the game a couple of years later that it just clicked. Sekiro's not an RPG, it's an action-adventure game with a single combat style. You have one weapon. Sure, you have prosthetic tools, but they're pretty situational. That isn't a negative though. I'm sure you've seen all the videos talking about how Sekiro is perfectly balanced, and it's true. The fact that From Software didn't have to account for dozens of different weapons means that each boss in this game is specifically designed to be defeated in one way. This game relies on deflections, not parries as some people like to call it. You have to build up the enemy's posture bar, and when you break it you can one-shot them. And you do such a small amount of HP damage, so deflecting it is literally essential. And deflecting attacks in Sekiro is simply the single most satisfying game mechanic that I've ever seen. It's like a rhythm game, learning each boss's moves and being able to deflect everything. It's quite forgiving too. As long as you learn how to deflect, you've got the game locked down. Mikiri counters are another mechanic which just requires you to dodge into an attack or jump over it. And it provides similar feedback, it will never get old. It does have the drawback of getting much easier the more you play it though. Unlike the Souls games where you can just start a new run with a different build, Sekiro requires you to play the game as it intended. However, repeated runs of Sekiro remain satisfying due to the sense of accomplishment that comes from your general skill level increasing. Seriously, the first time I fought Ishin it took like 3 hours, but on my second playthrough, 3 attempts. I can imagine that the game might lose some of its fun factor the more I play it, but I've completed Sekiro 4 times now and I still enjoy it just as much, because the core mechanics are so polished and so fun that it simply doesn't matter. It also helps that the level and world design is like in another universe. It's similar to Bloodborne where there's one big area in the centre of the map which branches off into many different areas. The difference is that it's much more interconnected as there are various different ways to get to certain areas. The individual areas are quite straightforward compared to previous games, as they're pretty railroaded, but traversal options like the grappling hook and also the environments being a bit more open makes it better. Lots of these areas have cool little ideas too. If Demon Souls had gimmicky bosses, then Sekiro has gimmicky level design. The fog in the Hidden Forest, the lightning guy in Fountainhead Palace, etc. It's the gameplay variety that keeps Sekiro engaging from start to finish, and they never step too far and make any area in the game frustrating. Sekiro is just basically flawless. I don't have anything negative to say about it, and it gets better every time I play it. Is it a Souls-like? Well, there are healing gourds and bonfire checkpoints, but even if it isn't, I still think it deserves to be here. Dark Souls was my introduction to From Software back in 2013, so there might be a bit of bias in this placement. My nostalgia for this game's way off the charts, but I do genuinely believe that it holds up today. Let's get the obvious out of the way, the world design. It's simply the best in any game, pulling from Metroidvanias with its interconnectivity, not just individual levels which do loop around on themselves with those classic shortcuts, but the overall world is so connected. The lift that takes you from the Undead Parish back down to Firelink Shrine, or the lower Undead Burg leading back to Firelink Shrine, is just flawless. It makes the first half of the game feel like one giant level, and I don't even want to imagine how difficult it was to design. Does the game get worse after Anor Londo? Well, kind of. Lost Izalith is the worst area in the game. It feels really unfinished and it's a shame, the Bed of Chaos being the absolute low point. But I've always loved the Duke's Archives and New Londo Ruins. The former has some annoying enemies, but I love its interconnectivity, and the latter has a deep atmosphere. Now, the boss fights are another high point here. They act more like skill checks rather than gimmick bosses of Demon Souls, and the boss designs range from majestic to utterly horrifying. Their movesets are mostly quite simple, but they're still far more complex than in Demon Souls. Gwyn can be cheesed by parrying though, which is still funny all these years later. And the build variety in Dark Souls 1 is just incredible. Obviously some weapons are absolutely useless, but you could pretty effectively just use magic or go all in on a strength build. The game is quite obtuse with weird gameplay mechanics, but it's nowhere near as egregious as Demon Souls or Dark Souls 2. Humanity is probably what comes to mind first. Having to reverse hollowing at a bonfire in order to summon is a bit cumbersome, and having a fixed number of Estus flasks until you kindle is also strange. It lacks the satisfaction of finding Estus shards and upgrading that way, and once you're able to kindle up to 20 Estus flasks it becomes a bit overkill. Like, that is more than enough for healing, so the latter part of the game eliminates that stressful, almost survival horror-esque aspect of managing your healing. But it's not really a big deal since you can just choose not to engage with it. The game also shows its age with rolling, as when you're locked on you can only roll in 4 directions, which vastly limits your movement. But everything else holds up. It's a significantly slower paced game than Bloodborne onwards, but that means that each and every swing of your sword must be calculated so you don't get punished. Dark Souls 1 remains a masterpiece to this day, and its influence is just staggering to think about. Sure, later games would squash some of this game's problems, and some of the late game areas aren't the best, but as an overall experience, I think that Dark Souls holds up extremely well, and you owe it to yourself to play it. So if you've been paying attention, this shouldn't come as a surprise to you. I mean, it's the only game left, but also Elden Ring just feels like the ultimate Souls experience. It combines all of the best elements of every other game on this list and leaves out all of the weird gimmicky stuff. To top it off, Elden Ring has one of the most well-crafted open worlds in the entire industry. And the open world is really the highlight here. I actually rushed through the game just to get some footage for this video, and it felt so wrong. Every time I do a playthrough of Elden Ring, I end up doing all the side content because this is a game that rewards exploration. Rushing through just to go to each legacy dungeon doesn't feel right to me, and to be fair, you'll end up being extremely underleveled if you skip the side content. There is some copy pasting, and I'm not a big fan of the catacombs, but I never found the boss situation to be too bad since most of the Remembrance bosses are quite unique. But it's such a visually stunning game, there's nothing else on this scale that looks as beautiful as Elden Ring does. It's also very dense, and the fact that the game segments each region into its own miniature open world section helps to keep the pacing really consistent too. The legacy dungeons, as they call it, are on the same level and in some cases better than some of the areas from previous From Software games. Lanedale is quite possibly the best thing that they've ever done. Getting there for the first time was comparable to Anor Londo, and then finding out that the entire city was explorable was just insane. Elden Ring also has the best weapon and build variety of any game. They brought back power stancing from Dark Souls 2, but to top it off, they included basically every weapon in the trilogy. I mean, yeah, bleed builds are absolutely busted, but there's so much more to the game. I even did a mage build on one of my playthroughs because magic in Elden Ring's really fun and varied compared to previous games. There are some things I wish that Elden Ring did better though. Now this might be sacrilege to some people, but I kind of wish that there was some kind of quest log. I don't want objective markers or anything like that. Nothing to tell me where I need to go, but I just want some way to be able to track which NPCs I've spoken to because there's so much going on in this game, and it's very easy to forget about certain quest lines and then fail them because I progressed too far. The game also has quite a steep difficulty spike in the last third of the game, which considering that the rest of the game was fairly beginner friendly, it does stick out a bit. I personally love the challenge as I always thought Elden Ring was quite easy up until the last couple of dungeons, but I can see how it might throw some people off. Honestly though, any complaints I may have about Elden Ring is nothing compared to the many hundreds of hours of enjoyment that I've gotten out of it. I return to it every 3 to 4 months because I just love it so much. It's probably my favourite game of all time. It was Dark Souls 1 before, so I have no hesitation putting it at the top of this list. I get so excited just thinking about what From Software could do to build upon Elden Ring. I have some ideas, but that's a topic for another day. But that's going to wrap it up for today. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I have to ask, do you agree with my placements or do you think I'm way off? Let me know in the comments. Also, make sure that you subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!